churning the air, mechanical and grating among the softer, natural sounds of the rainforest. The SB-1 Defiant carried the 7 shadowy figures to their destination. They talked amongst themselves, having finished the briefing hours ago, and now they just waited, patient and aware for their time to move. The distress signal had come in less than a day ago, and while Ares would usually work under the cover of night if possible, there was no time to waste. As a satellite research station for Umbral, Viridian Laboratories' call for help should have been sent to Umbral only. But human beings were imperfect. There was no telling if one of the employees had broken the secrecy protocol. People had done stranger things in the face of certain death, after all. And Project Chimera certainly had the potential for death, destruction, mutilation, all of the above, really. If things had really gone belly up at Viridian, Ares needed to be on site as soon as possible to clean things up. There were only so many roads that led to where they needed to be, and to Hawkeye it wasn't looking good for him. He was sick and tired of all the green, the heaviness of the air, and the way it made his uniform stick to his body like a second skin. It was gearing up to be another boring mission for the sniper, with no high points for him to post up at. But Ares never activated without every member being involved. So, like it or not, he was going to have to hike over a mile with his rifle on his back, and play backup to the members that were far more suited to close quarters type of work. And he wasn't the only Ares member that felt a familiar frustration with the mission to Viridian. Labs run by corporations like Umbral weren't hidden in the deep jungle for no reason, which meant whatever they were about to encounter was going to be one hell of a surprise. Their briefing was vague, which wasn't anything new, but it often left them at a disadvantage. Their commands, though, were simple enough. Destroy any organic life except for mentally intact level 5 scientists. Eliminate those deemed mentally deficient. If possible, harvest samples of any non-terrestrial life forms. Hawkeye wasn't sure what non-terrestrial could be referring to, but he'd seen some weird things working for Umbral and the Initiative, mostly through his scope. It wasn't in his job description to ask the specifics, just to get it done as quickly and efficiently as possible. That he was good with. There wasn't much, non-terrestrial or otherwise, that he couldn't put a bullet through. The helicopter began to circle for landing, the mark a dirt road just wide enough to make the landing possible. From there, they would take the road deep into the jungle, where it narrowed enough to be hidden completely by the thick overgrowth of the canopy, finally arriving at Viridian within 90 minutes of disembarking the chopper. 90 miserable, sweaty minutes hauling his on his back. He looked around the chopper as everyone gathered their things for departure, pulling helmets on and finding room on their gear for any last-minute weapons or gadgets that they might want to take. His loadout was simple enough, but a few of the others were a bit more selective, even experimental with their equipment. He himself, of course, carried his trusty AWM sniper rifle and a lightweight Glock 19 for a sidearm, to keep a low profile and stay nimble. His uniform was clean and minimalistic. His gas mask, which was a practical safeguard on most missions, had a polarized visor for glare reduction when he needed to aim with it on. As Hawkeye tightened his lightweight plate carrier, Sentinel moved seats to sit next to him, taking a few minutes one-on-one with him like he did each Ares member before the start of the mission. There wasn't much that couldn't be shared amongst the entire team, but just in case, their leader liked to have a finger on the pulse of what was going on with his group.
You remember where we're going to need you if the building ends up being fully occupied, right?
Hawkeye nodded. There was a single usable high point where the security team for Viridian would launch surveillance drones from, about 1 story taller than the rest of the warehouse laboratory.
Yeah, I've got it.
Clapping him on the shoulder, Sentinel almost stood to leave, but paused.
Hawk, I don't know what it is, but I've got a weird feeling about this one. If you need to get up high, just go. Don't worry about asking me. I trust you. Got it?
A shroud of concern settled over the sniper, and whatever annoyance he had about the job that day quickly faded. Sentinel was never overly cautious unless it was for a reason, which meant Hawkeye needed to be on high alert.
Understood, sir. You can count on me.
Once the chopper was back in the sky, leaving them until they called for extraction, Aegis and Jester pulled their fabric masks back down again. Dust from the takeoff settled to the ground, and since they could breathe clearly again and they were seemingly isolated, there was no reason to keep their faces covered, for the moment at least. Aegis looked at the demolitions expert and already felt a touch more exhausted seeing the smirk on his face. "When you look like that, it means trouble. What's going on?" Team Ares moved into formation as they headed into the jungle. Sentinel and Hawkeye taking point, followed by Cypher and Tempest, then Aegis and Jester, and finally Raptor at the rear. Jester wasn't usually her partner. She had a fondness for Raptor, and Sentinel seemed to have a sixth sense when she wasn't at her best. But they were all trained to mesh almost seamlessly with one another. So, working with him wasn't an issue. But the look on his face certainly was. Jester shrugged one shoulder. "If you haven't caught on, then I won't burden you with my knowledge." Aegis leaned to the side, closer to her partner, and hissed. "If you don't want a stunner rub next time you fall asleep on the flight home, then I suggest you spit it out." "Jeez, calm down, lady," he chuckled, but it was obvious he was more than happy to share. It was a long march to Viridian Labs, and he loved nothing more than gossiping to pass the time. "I have this tactic. When Umbral wants to give us next to nothing to go on, where I base my feelings about a mission off of how Cypher is acting. And man, is the rookie a mess today. A mess, for a member of Ares, would look nothing more than cool, unflappable confidence in anyone else. They were all supposed to be unmovable, unshakable, and for the most part, Cypher was right on track with the rest of them. But if Aegis looked closer, watched the way he moved and how he only gave Tempest one-word answers when the other rookie spoke to him, she could see the difference in the younger man. It took a keen eye to pick it out, but Cypher was visibly shaken. The possible explanation for young Cypher being so on edge made Aegis's stomach drop. "You don't really think," she started, but Jester was one step ahead of her. "Do I think that he's poking around in Umbral's private servers a little too deeply out of the awful curiosity of youth? Why, yes, Aegis, I do think that. And I think whatever he found about this mission, it's not sitting well with him." Narrowing her eyes, she fixed her eyes on Cypher for a few more long seconds before shaking her head. "Damn you. I think you're right. Why exactly is this funny to you? Now come on, you know me better than that." His smirk turned into a full-on grin. "If whatever we're about to stumble onto is bad enough to make Cypher nervous, then it's definitely going to be an interesting time. Umbro will kill him if they find out," Aegis said, more to herself than anyone else, any trace of annoyance gone and leaving her sounding hollow. The multi-billion-dollar corporation that funded the Eclipse Initiative and consequently controlled Ares was not anything to play with. With that, Jester's face went serious too. "I know. I hope the kid wises up," he sighed. "I really do." The kid in question was already severely regretting his decision to dip into the files for their mission to Viridian. If he could scrub it all out of his brain, he would, but there was no such luck. Project Chimera. the chimeric anomaly. Cypher couldn't wrap his head around it, and he was as brilliant as they came. Something terrible was waiting for them at Viridian, and only his intense training kept him from bolting and taking his chances in the forest. His chances would be slim at best, too. The entire rainforest around them was so powerfully verdant and alive, the calls of the local fauna so loud that he could hardly hear himself think. Flies, so small that he couldn't see them, buzzed around his face to the point where he pulled his face covering back up from his neckline, leaving only his eyes uncovered. What a beautiful, miserable place it was. Tempest, the other newcomer in Ares, was unbothered by the muggy, cacophonous forest. She chattered on, gloved fingers tapping a rhythm on her SMG as she walked, acting like this was just another day at the office, and not yet another march destined to end in death and destruction. Being constantly partnered with Tempest was fine, but the two of them were both fools at times in their own special ways. Tempest, for example, trying to fight her way with just a combat knife out of a horde of infected, enraged humans. Cypher, though, was a fool for hacking into the system of the very corporation they worked for. 2 peas in an idiot pod, he thought dejectedly. Slowly, the trees began to thin, the road they walked on growing wider, packed dirt becoming gravel. There were no markers or anything to indicate that Viridian laboratories were just up ahead, but the seasoned team members knew the signs of habitation. It wasn't much farther. Cypher shouldered his TAR-21 assault rifle. Finally, the warehouse that contained the secret laboratory rose up in front of them, a ghostly specter of iron-gray stone in a sea of emerald. It was intact for the most part, only one portion of the east wall blown to pieces and dotting the jungle floor with crumbling, man-made rock. Viridian was utilitarian, but it still held its facade as nothing but a warehouse well enough that any unsuspecting explorer wouldn't be overly interested if they saw it. Ares, though, knew very well what was lying beneath their feet. At least, they thought they did. Being part of the Eclipse Initiative often led to surprises, mundane or terrible in equal frequency. Whatever had caused them to activate the distress signal wasn't obvious from a distance. But as the team approached the warehouse, it became more and more clear that something was devastatingly wrong. The few visible windows were shattered, the heavy stainless steel front doors swinging wide open, and in many places a shimmering iridescent slime caught the sparse sunlight as it filtered through the trees. Then there were the corpses. They were positioned in a sloppy circle, all of their heads in the center, and their bodies radiating out from the circle in a macabre star. Each of them had bled from their nose, eyes, ears, and mouths, and the once red blood had gone black in the summer sun. Fat, buzzing flies congregated around their faces, infesting them in the places that gave the least resistance. The air smelled of putrefaction, and above it, something sickly sweet. On their heads, faces, necks, and in some cases their chests, that sparkling slime was all too apparent. Almost in synchronized movement, all of Ares pulled their face coverings on and donned their gas masks, their eyes watering from the stench of the place. They didn't linger, giving the circle of the dead a wide berth in their approach to the warehouse. Identifying the dead was not part of the objective, but there was a shudder of unease that ran through them all, and the image of the starburst of limbs and bodies wouldn't soon leave them. Silent now, and moving like a single, seven-headed creature, Ares entered the warehouse and took their first look at the interior of the place. It was, or at least had been, clean and nondescript. The front desk, ancillary waiting area, and forward-facing facade of Viridian was sleek and modern, tarnished by streaks of red, black, and even more slime. Chairs had been knocked over, papers scattering the smooth concrete floor. Area rugs were bunched together, some of them damp from where the rain had made its way through the shattered windows. It was eerily quiet, but from what Raptor could see, all of the scientists and administrative workers were outside in the corpse wheel. So at least the inside wasn't as fouled as the outside yet. At the rear of the formation, he took one last look at the outside and closed the doors behind them all, snapping a chair leg off a discarded seat and shoving it through the door handles. Not an elegant solution to keeping it closed, but functional enough that they would at least know if someone or something was coming at them from behind. But Raptor knew whatever they were looking for was never going to be up there, on the top floor. That'd be too easy. It was simply a front for whatever terror Umbral was cooking up beneath his feet. Another damned lab, of course. And he was sick to hell of labs. They could hear the distress beacon going off, a high-pitched pinging that hit 3 times before falling off into a lower, discordant note that had goosebumps springing to life on all of their skin. That was the point, though. It was supposed to unsettle them, to feel utterly wrong, and it succeeded. There was more than the sound, too. Raptor didn't say anything about it to the rest of them, but this place was doing something to him. It was subtle. A pressure behind his eyes, the smell of ozone in the air. But whatever it was, it pulled at the animal parts of his mind and told him over again to run, run, run. Sentinel's voice shook him out of his thoughts as he spoke to the whole team.
We need to sweep this floor, and then we can go to the basement. I don't want any surprises taking us from behind, so let's be thorough.
Jester giggled. No doubt about the behind comment. A series of offices, storage rooms, and server rooms. There wasn't much going on upstairs. One room, full of paper files stored neatly, tripped them up. It took some time to drag all the records out into the main reception area and torch them. But as usual, there could be no traces of Umbral or their research left behind. Burnt paper and ozone. If he was a lesser man, it would make him sick. While Cypher finished with the files, the rest of Ares moved forward through the rest of the hall. The final room was destroyed, and they entered with more caution than the others. The door was blown off, everything inside charred to ash. It looked like it had been a restroom beforehand, shattered pieces of porcelain crunching under the heavy boots of the team. Open to the elements now, the team could see that rain had fallen recently enough. All of the detritus not under the remnants of the roof changed to a sticky, wet soot. The destruction wasn't burnt to black carbon, though, but a chalky gray that was picked up by the wind and stirred around where it had managed to remain dry. Jester knelt, swiping his fingers through a portion of the ash and humming to himself.
White phosphorus.
Those words stirred the team somewhat. No amount of armor could save them from that sort of fire.
What the hell? Why?
Sentinel asked, kneeling beside the corporal to get a closer look.
That's scorched earth level of destruction. In a bathroom? Well, we aren't exactly the first line of attack either.
Jester laughed, but there was no humor in it as he stood.
Let's finish this room and get the hell out of here.
It was more difficult than the rest of the warehouse thus far, the level of destruction obscuring any real structure or form of the place. Sentinel, Raptor, and Hawkeye were old enough to have seen white phosphorus used in the field, and Aegis experienced enough to have treated those wounded by it, and they were sober and silent as they investigated the space. Ares as a whole was almost finished when Tempest's voice stopped them all.
There's someone here. He's
alive. The word came out of a throat that sounded full of razor blades, pained and harshly cut. Alive was a strong word for whatever the man was. Aegis made it to him first, but from the grim look on her face, the team knew it was going to be a bleak outcome. But anyone would make the same assumption, seeing what was left of the scientist. Most of his clothes were burnt off. A lanyard with a plastic ID card melted into his bare chest and his pants scorched away to the knee. His skin was bubbled up in places, and was whole and untouched in others. Circular marks covered parts of him, red and raw even on the healthy skin. Majority of his face was intact, except for the stripe of flesh on his temple that curved up into his hairline and over his left eye. It left the socket empty and white bone flashing out among the blackened skin. He was collapsed in the rubble, just outside where the collapsed wall would have been, laying on the side with his head pillowed on his outstretched arm. Aegis knew immediately why he was where he was. The rain must have been a moment of sweet relief on the burns, but the sun was no doubt making him regret using that last bit of energy to crawl out into the open. The medic heard the subtle sound of Tempest raising her sidearm. Her custom chrome beretta glistened in a stray ray of sunlight. Aegis held her hand up.
Not yet.
But Tempest was having none of it.
Look at him, Aegis. It's hopeless. Let me put him out of his misery.
Let her. Dear God, let her, the man rasped. Swallowing hard, she moved her medical pack off her side and unzipped it, pulling out a pre-filled syringe of morphine. After a moment of consideration, she pulled out another, knowing she was skating the razor's edge of overdosing the man, but not seeing any other choice to get him through it.
I can't,
she told both the scientist and Tempest at the same time, turning her head halfway to look at her teammate from the corner of her eye.
Look at his badge.
Tempest knelt down, squinting to read the mostly melted plastic, but eventually making sense of the only thing that mattered. Level 5 clearance.
Damn. Poor bastard.
The private sighed, standing but holstering her sidearm. Aegis agreed, but didn't say it out loud. She knew that Umbral was watching, their helmet and body cams having been mandated since the inception of the Eclipse Initiative. If she didn't follow orders, well, there would be consequences. The scientist would have screamed if he was able, but it was just a hiss of misery that came out when she injected him in one of the few patches of whole skin on his body. They couldn't linger, but they were also supposed to extract living scientists if they were mentally intact. She knew better than anyone when a mercy killing was the morally correct thing to do. But morality didn't play into the work she did with Ares. That was something she'd just have to carry on in her soul. There was no other choice. This man wasn't the first, and he certainly wouldn't be the last for her. She removed her mask. "Tell me what happened," she asked him quietly, watching as the morphine drove away some of the frantic pain from his remaining eye. "In as few words as you can." "Project Chimera," he grated out. "Self-healing cellular compounds. Self-replicating DNA." The scientist coughed, but there was no moisture in his throat. "Escaped." Then, Sentinel was next to her, the rest of the team fanning out around them with their backs turned to guard their occupied leader and healer. The enormous Major slung his Remington ACR over his back and took a small canteen off his belt, unscrewing the cap and dribbling a little water into the gaping mouth of the burnt man.
Answer me these questions, and we can let you be done talking, son. What escaped? Where is it? And did this explosion destroy or injure it?
The chimeric anomaly. Extraterrestrial. Hiding. Basement. Injured but alive. He couldn't swallow, but the water helped his tongue to move at least. I almost had it. Sentinel let Aegis continue to do what she could for the burnt man, and surprised understanding hit him at his words.
You did this? Blew this room up?
He moved his head down once in a minuscule nod. Yeah. And then forcefully. Please kill me. Sentinel's jaw worked, but he shook his head.
Can't do that, son. But I'd give you that mercy if I could.
He stood, laying a hand on the healer's shoulder.
Knock him out, Aegis.
So she did, with a third quick syringe to the side of his neck, out of a lack of anything else she could do to help. Aegis sprayed disinfectant foam on the worst of the burns now that he wasn't conscious to feel the sting of it. She commanded Sentinel and Raptor to pick the man up as gently as possible, moving him into the shade and laying him on his back instead of on his side. And that was it. There was nothing else possible until it was time for extraction, and he might very well still die from the shock of being carried out if the heavy narcotics couldn't keep him under long enough. Shaking off the awfulness of it, Aegis rolled her neck, clenching and unclenching her hands to center herself, until she was firmly out of the healer mind space and back into that of a soldier. She picked her MP5 off the grimy tile floor. There wasn't room for both versions of Alicia Alvarez in her head. Existing as both at the same time would drive her mad. The burnt room left dozens of questions unanswered. What could survive a blast like that? And how did a scientist get a hold of a white phosphorus grenade? But those weren't questions for Ares to answer, so none of them even bothered to voice their curiosity as the team headed for the back of the warehouse. There, with no button to press, only a panel with the laser sensor beside it, 2 stainless steel elevator doors were closed tight. Further to the right, there was a single unassuming, normal door with the same laser panel, which they hoped led to a set of stairs that would take them down. Where they stood, on the top floor, there was no power. But the distress beacon that still called from below told them that there was some source of backup electricity for the lab. It took Cypher a little bit of time, and some brute force with a screwdriver to pull the laser panel away from the wall, but he managed to link the wiring behind the panel with his wrist computer module. Minutes later, the lock turned over with a muted thunk, and he pulled the door open. It was good to put his mind to something else besides the things he had seen in the briefing files for this lab late last night. He didn't think that the rest of Ares was taking the scientist's mention of extraterrestrial serious enough. And Umbral never mentioned the chimeric anomaly as specifically being alien in nature. But there was little doubt in Cypher's mind that they were about to run into something that human brains weren't really capable of processing. Ares moved as a unit down the corrugated metal stairs, their boots causing their steps to echo above the buzzing of overhead lights and the constant pinging of the distress signal. One by one, they felt the pressure behind their eyes increase, but it didn't slow any of them down. At the bottom, the white walls of the underground laboratory stretched out so far that it was almost mind-boggling. The space was almost twice as large as the upper warehouse. Every inch of it lit up so brightly that it took a moment for their vision to adjust. It was cold and sterile. Every surface stainless steel, and all of the implements organized with nothing left out or forgotten. At least in the areas that hadn't been destroyed. Sentinel jerked his head in the direction of the lower server room, which was as perfectly white and glossy as everything else, separated only by solid glass walls. He pointed to Cypher, then Hawkeye, sending them to deactivate the distress beacon while the rest of the team tried to figure out what had happened. The destruction wasn't all-consuming. In fact, it almost seemed carefully controlled, existing in small pockets while the rest of the lab remained flawless. Along the walls were dozens of state-of-the-art pieces of research equipment, red and green lights blinking happily with no one to tend to them anymore. These were all untouched, but a large metal cage that once held lab mice was overturned on the ground, droppings, and wood chips scattered about, and not a mouse in sight. It was the same for the parts of the lab that were more human-oriented. Just like the last lab the team had investigated, back in the States on that forsaken college campus, there were rows and rows of hospital beds. Covered with clean sheets and fitted with both leather and metal restraints for hands, feet, head, and even necks, it wasn't hard for the team to guess what they had been used for: human testing. Not at all surprising, being a satellite lab for Umbral, but distasteful nonetheless. Most of the beds were fine, but a few had been bent into pretzel-like shapes. Where there was havoc, there was also the same slime from above, even more iridescent in the harsh halogen light. The smell of ozone was stronger than ever, increasing right along with the pressure in their heads, but so far there was no indication of what exactly had caused the chaos. There weren't any more dead to be found either, but none of the team missed the streaks of cherry red on the floors and walls here and there, left like a calling card. None of that surprised them. The entire wall of glass, shattered in the center that looked out over an occupied hangar bay, did. The hangar was large, but purpose-built to hold the single craft inside of it. It was squat, similar in size to a B-2 bomber, but longer instead of wide. Featureless and dark, gunmetal gray, there appeared to be nothing on the craft that could provide propulsion. It was crumbled in on one side, indicating a crash, but the team couldn't find any other defining features on the craft from where they stood.
That scientist,
Aegis breathed, looking at her commander.
he said extraterrestrial, didn't he? In our briefing. Non-terrestrial? I figured they just meant unknown in origin, but this... it's a ship, isn't it?
Sentinel wanted to know more, just like she did. But with each passing second and each odd discovery, he felt dread pressing on him more and more. He needed to finish the job and get his team out of there.
None of our concern whether it is or not. Sweep the area for signs of life. Destroy anything that isn't someone with top-level clearance.
Normally, it wouldn't be a problem to move in teams of 2 if they needed to sweep a large area, like the lab and hangar. The overarching sense of foreboding had them in a tight formation the entire time. 10 minutes into the sweep, they hadn't found a single sign of life, but the distress beacon finally went silent. Cypher had managed to do his job, and he and Hawkeye would be rejoining them shortly. It was bizarre, but even the cages that would normally hold animals for testing were empty. It should have meant that Ares was going to have an easy mission with no signs of violence, but Sentinel knew that Umbral wouldn't have sent them out just to clear an empty underground lab. It kicked his pulse up, knowing that something or someone was just waiting to be found. At first, they didn't hear it, but once they finished with the lab and made their way to the hangar, the wet, sucking sounds became apparent. He held up a fist in the air to halt the team and motioned them to raise their weapons and stay alert. Ultimately, that was pointless. No living person could have missed what moved out from behind the mysterious craft at an unhurried pace, freezing the team in place as it approached. It slithered towards them, its glistening tentacles skimming sterile ceramic tile. Sentinel knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that what he was looking at didn't belong. The thing was composed of an assemblage of writhing appendages, melding seamlessly with its oozing, bulbous central mass. Sickly, phosphorescent patches speckled its molted form, dim in the fluorescent light of the lab, but undoubtedly eerie in the darkness. Similar in size to a Humvee, but gelatinous enough to squeeze through the smaller frame of the hangar window, the thing moved and even breathed. He couldn't wrap his mind around how it was even possible. Amorphous, there were no indications of eyes or a mouth on the central part of the creature, but none of the team even thought for a second that it wasn't sentient. because it spoke to them, right in the core of that pressure behind their eyes. The words were silent in reality, but bounced around the inside of their skulls like buckshot.
Seekers of violence,
it whispered, the words guttural and in some nameless language, but somehow still understandable there in their thoughts.
You have opened the way for me, but there is no gratitude in me now for humans. Submit and it will be less painful.
Hearing the Chimera didn't hurt so much as it made them feel like there wasn't enough room inside of them anymore. The words vibrated through their minds, down their spine, and even in their guts. If Ares hadn't been an elite force, if each individual member hadn't been trained to the point that they hovered on the edge of their minds, splintering, they might have panicked. Instead, there was a single utterance of, "What the fuck?" from Tempest, and nothing more. The human parts of them were panicking in the face of something so incomprehensible. But Umbral had crafted a second part of each team member that kept them steady and whole. The soldier. They fanned out into a half circle around the Chimera, their guns all aimed at the end mass of it. Patterns flashed in the flesh of the thing like little supernovas, reminiscent of a cuttlefish. It had stopped advancing with any sort of speed, content to pore over the broken glass of the windows that looked into the hangar bay, paying no mind to the glass that should have cut it to pieces. Circular suction cups on the inside of each tentacle popped and restuck to surfaces as it moved, leaving small acidic burns where they grabbed on.
I consumed every human that struck me with those projectiles, like the ones you were holding. An annoyance and nothing more.
The Ares members saw flashes of visions. Security guards rolled into tentacles and absorbed through a slow, terrible osmosis, clothes falling to the floor empty once it was done. Then, those too scared to fight back, dispatched with fibers that poured from the center of the suction cups, which opened like flowers and spilled them forth into their mouths, down their throats, and then wrapping around their hearts until they stopped. Sentinel could hear Aegis screaming, and then Jester heaving, but the visions kept coming. They all saw the Chimera carrying the bodies to the front of Viridian, placing them in the wheel shape, then the same fibers from before snaking out and coalescing it into one thin rope that penetrated the ear of the first still warm corpse, coming out the other side, and directly into the ear of the next. In and out, it connected the dead until the rope was through the brain of each. Slowly, with delicate care that it hadn't displayed anywhere else, the Chimera absorbed their knowledge. Once it was done, retracting the tendril with such a quick snap that the corpses' heads knocked together. The last vision was just a flash, as if they weren't supposed to see it. A small man, vaguely familiar, pulled a robin egg blue grenade from an emergency lockbox on a wall. The creature pursued, lured into the bathroom, where the man detonated the grenade in a wall of fire so intense and hot that the Chimera felt true fear for the first time in its existence. Gravely injured and in fear, it fled to the one familiar thing it knew, the ship in the hangar, where it hunkered down to regenerate the parts of it that were burnt away. Maybe the Chimera hadn't expected the minds of the Ares members to be as strong as they were, because Sentinel got the distinct impression that it was annoyed that the last vision managed to spill over before it was able to pull away. And he held onto it hard, for that reason alone. It told him one invaluable thing. It could be injured by fire. Sentinel assessed the situation as fast as he could, and the first thing he noticed was that Hawkeye and Cypher were still gone. Good. The lab and hangar were an absolute shit show of a setting for an altercation, especially if fire was going to be involved. They needed to get outside, and fast. He never thought he'd consider a forest fire as a best-case scenario, but he had no idea how hard this thing was going to be to kill. All of his team that were present were still on their feet, some looking more nauseous than others, but everyone was still alert and on guard. The Chimera was undulating, still not charging them, but waiting on their next move instead. Sentinel was banking on the idea that the Chimera couldn't read their thoughts, but just push its own onto them. Umbral would have never kept something that could pick apart minds and extract secret information without even needing any sort of physical contact. Sucking the knowledge out of the dead was another story, though. There was a good chance that ability would be news to Umbral, considering that they probably hadn't been offering the thing dead people just to research its reaction. The distance to the stairs and outside wasn't a short one, but knowing that Hawkeye had already escaped with Cypher made him even more sure that they needed to lure the Chimera out. Not having them there put them at the obvious disadvantage of not knowing what the sniper and the codebreaker had in store. Communication was impossible if there was any chance that the creature would be able to hear it, but he trusted his team, every one of them, so he had to make a move. Sentinel's entire thought process happened in the space between seconds, rapid fire, and once he had decided, he set Ares into action. With a series of curt hand signals, he had the team spread out even wider, simultaneously moving backwards, firing into the Chimera in an unending stream of bullets. It had said that bullets were only an annoyance, but thousands of them might be a different story. The Chimera came for them, but the 5 Ares members were a very disjointed target at that point, and it caused the creature to hesitate. On they went, firing forward and walking backwards, still in a half-moon formation. Like that, everyone had eyes on one another through their peripherals. They were able to give each other short warnings if there were any obstacles that might trip them up, since they were walking blind.
Aegis, 2 feet to the right.
From Raptor, and the healer corrected.
Reloading!
From Tempest, and we ensured she was properly covered.
Sentinel, 3 feet to your left.
From Jester, and the commander listened without pause. It was slowed by the hail of bullets, but not stopped. The projectiles were absorbed into the mass of the thing, before being slowly pushed back out and hitting the tile floor with a clang. Sentinel quickly realized it was the heat of the bullets entering the Chimera's body that bothered it most, not the impact, and filed the information away for later. He was confident that Jester knew what to do once they were outside. If it would be enough was the real question. They felt the creature try to speak to them as they led it away from the hangar and towards the stairs, but the barrage of shots kept it too occupied to finish a complete thought.
Enough. It's prolonging the inevitable. There's nothing left.
Only 2 phrases wrung any sort of feeling out of Sentinel.
Taken from my family. Never wanted to be here.
A younger version of Nate Delacroix might have felt some sort of guilt, but Sentinel didn't. There was only an echo of where an unfamiliar emotion should have been. 10 feet from the stairwell, the Chimera upped the aggression, those tentacles lashing out and only missing at their swipes and grabs because of the quick reaction time of the Ares members. Sentinel was starting to become concerned about what would happen when they were crammed into the tight stairwell with a thing. Then the sprinkles came on from overhead, immediately soaking all of them, the Chimera included. Water didn't slow it, besides the quick second of surprise when the water first hit its soft body. But the water was just a means to an end for Ares. Viridian Laboratory kept its image of clean, modern lines all the way down to the wiring of the many machines in their lab. There were no loose wires, all of them gathered into black casings and moving across the walls to their respective outlets at perfect 90-degree angles where necessary. As the water pooled on the tile floor under the rubber soles of their combat boots, Raptor swerved out of formation, yanking one of those stylish plugs from the wall, holding his M4 carbine under one arm and yanking the head of the thing with his gloved hands. His smile was as predatory as his code name when he dropped the live bundle of wires to the wet ground, where it invisibly electrified the entire floor and consequently the Chimera. It made the first noise the Ares team had heard, a watery keen that felt like ragged fingernails across their nerves. It was in pain, going stiff, every imaginable color firing off beneath its skin in an involuntary light show.
Go!
Sentinel yelled, waving his team forward, and when they were all on the stairs, following behind them, keeping his eye on the Chimera until it was out of sight completely. None of them had any illusions that the alien was completely incapacitated, but they managed to make it to the front door, left open by Hawkeye before they heard the sucking sound of it on the distant parts of the warehouse. Jester was the third one out of Viridian and into the dappled sunlight of the rainforest, Raptor and Sentinel coming behind him. His heart was racing, adrenaline flooding his system, and he loved it. Loved every minute of the morally bankrupt, unscrupulous job he had fallen into, so far removed from building pipe bombs in his grandmother's basement as a kid. A fucking alien, he had thought, seeing the thing crawling out from behind the mere bright gunmetal craft in the hangar. I'm never retiring. Watching the vision of the poor bastards who died getting their brains plundered had made him sick, but what came after washed that all away. A vulnerability to fire meant one thing, that he was going to get to use his new toy in real combat. Finally. Working for Umbral meant Ares and every other team operating under the Eclipse Initiative got top-of-the-line, cutting-edge equipment years before anyone in the government or civilian sphere even knew it existed. When they had made the weapon he was currently unclipping from his back, throwing his shotgun over his shoulder by the strap in the process, Jester had thought he might cry from joy. The thought of using it on the gelatinous thing squelching out of the warehouse door brought on similar feelings. He'd been thinking about it when he laid his head down at night for weeks. He was positive. It didn't look like much, smaller than his AA-12, but bigger than his sidearm. The new weapon had a thick barrel that was bisected by an open metal cage that displayed the ammunition. They looked like oversized marbles, vaguely the size of golf balls, and the launcher only held 6 of them at a time. The ammunition caught the light of the sun, crafted from reflective glass and full of something sickly green. Over 150 years before, they had used something similar to destroy tanks in a war that everyone thought would consume the world. They called it the Ampulomet, and Jester, always one to appreciate a touch of nostalgia, insisted on calling the launcher by the same name. It was infinitely better than that string of letters and numbers Umbral had given it, in his opinion, at least. They wouldn't tell him what was in the ampules, but he had his guesses. His favorite theory was that Umbral had finally cracked Greek fire, and then immediately put it into the hands of an admitted pyromaniac, himself. When he had used it in testing, the incendiary had burned in a blue-white, superheated flame that was almost impossibly hot. The liquid inside the glass expanded into a foam upon contact, before igniting, nearly quadrupling the surface area that the liquid alone would be able to cover. It was small, quick, deadly, and had a simple, stunning explosion. Jester was in awe of the thing. The rest of the team saw him arm the Ampulomet and moved back a safe distance while the injured Chimera spilled out of the doorway. With its nebulous number of appendages and shifting shape, it was difficult to tell exactly how much harm it had obtained through electrocution, but its movements were jerkier, more uncoordinated. He felt it brush against his mind again, but there were no words, just a gargle. Jester raised the Ampulomet and fired. It ate through the Chimera like hot water through fresh snowfall, the smell so sharp and chemical that he had to breathe through his mouth to avoid it. The ampule fire produced nearly no smoke, and burned clean. It was so bright that it hurt his eyes. They all felt it in their skulls then, the pressure coming and going in sharp stabs, only the impressions of agony coming through. The Chimera was too big for one charge to do the job, so Jester loaded a second and fired, hitting home once more, and finally, the pressure in his head abated for good. As it burned, it began to churn and bubble, reminding him of a marshmallow in a campfire, growing puffy and blackened. They all thought it was over and done, but that was the team applying human expectations to something that was anything but. Inside of the creature, something split, and those horrible tendrils from the visions lashed out in a hurricane of fury. One hooked Jester around the ankle, pulling him to the ground, and it was all he could do to hold onto his weapon as he went down. Once one vine had him, the others came, lashing around the same ankle and pulling him towards the blaze, all within the span of a breath. Before the rest of Ares could move, there was a crack from somewhere above them, an exploding round hitting the origin point of the tendrils. Over half retracted, but when the rest held tight, Hawkeye shot again, and with another one of those hollow keens, the Chimera released Jester entirely. He was close enough to feel the heat on his face before the sniper saved him, and it was a sensation he wouldn't soon forget. With no reason to maintain radio silence anymore, Jester immediately flipped his comms on and told Hawkeye,
"You just had to steal my moment, didn't you?"
On top of the lookout point he had discussed earlier in the day, Hawkeye laughed and looked at Cypher, who had stuck with him after their flight from the lab. This fucking guy, huh? There was something somber about watching the extraterrestrial burn down to a pile of slush and ash, like they were witnessing the death of something monumental. So they gathered, until the flames flickered down to embers, and only called for extraction once they were sure it was finished. Aegis had been tasked with collecting samples of the Chimera, but instead she shoved the vials and collection tongs into Tempest's hands, and left to check on the scientist, who was miraculously still breathing. The healer administered a second dose of the sedative, and Tempest begrudgingly gathered the needed biological matter, presenting it to Aegis for approval once she was finished. There were a few pieces of the creature that had blown off from Hawkeye's shots, and unlike the rest of the thing's body, they were mostly whole and unburnt. Dead and separated from the Chimera, the tissue pieces were a jaundiced off-white, none of the colors from before flickering within. They managed to secure a piece of the tendril too, coiling it into the vial and sealing them all for transport. Now that there was no need for secrecy, the Defiant came right to Viridian, hovering over the trees and dropping a ladder for the team to ascend. Aegis stayed with the scientist until the rescue basket was lowered, followed by Sentinel, who helped her clip the unconscious man in. Whether he would survive was still up in the air, but they had done all they could. For the next 2 weeks, the entire Ares team, along with the scientist who was identified as exobiologist Howard Brighton and the rather annoyed duo of helicopter pilots, were locked down under quarantine. It wasn't a surprise. The same thing had happened after the Stonebridge incident, albeit for only a few days versus a few weeks. But that didn't make it any less boring. The 7 Ares members and the pilots came out of the quarantine perfectly healthy, having been treated by a multitude of mysterious drugs to guarantee that no otherworldly pathogen was multiplying inside of them. Howard Brighton was still in critical condition, but released to the care of Umbral's general medical team. Ares rested, recuperated, and prepared for their next activation. None of them told the others that, during the first week of quarantine, they dreamt of the night sky of a distant world, 3 moons crossing the horizon. In cold storage, the Chimera samples began to flicker.